The end of BPC. As Brazil's fiscal sustainability has been called into question, citizens wonder if Lula will cut the nation's growing social programs. As the U.S. has attempted to reduce its fiscal deficit with the Department of Government Efficiency, colloquially known as DOGE, its southern neighbor is undergoing a similar effort. At the time of this writing, President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva has announced the review of several expenditures of the Brazilian state, including the Continuous Cash Benefit, or BPC, a social program that covers over 80% of the nation's elderly. The review, which data indicates is expected to save 10 billion Brazilian reals so far, falls short of analyst expectations. The country faces severe structural reforms, and while the government is optimistic, most observers believe more change is needed. Concerns come from the weak Brazilian real, which reached an all-time low against the dollar, dropping below a 1-to-6 ratio earlier this year. The sustained depreciation has drained the spending power of the country's citizens, as well as threatened the country with capital outflows. The roots of the currency's long depreciation can be traced back to the end of the last commodity boom, back in 2014. Brazil, whose exports of varied commodities like iron ore, crude oil, and soybeans make up nearly 70% of the country's total, saw its economy crash into a recession. Once home to one of the 20th century's most effective monetary stabilization programs, Brazil now saw its currency and state revenues plummet in the bust. Accompanied by a series of political crises and corruption scandals, depreciation continued into 2016, stabilizing and dropping again during the COVID pandemic. The dysfunction of political elites left the country without an effective response, and the Brazilian economy never truly recovered. Today, fiscal sustainability is called into serious question. Historically, the federal government has collected tax revenues and distributed them out to Brazil's 26 states and thousands of municipalities. This relationship has inverted, however, and now local politics drive fiscal spending. According to data from the National Treasury, the number of federal transfers to states and municipalities increased 4.4 times between 2008 and 2024. The expansion of these transfers is just one sign of the state's increasing liabilities. Another is the BPC program. The Benefício de Prestação Continuada, as it is known in Portuguese, was one of many programs established in Brazil's 1988 constitution. Primarily targeting low-income people aged 65 or older, it consists of a number of cash transfers for those who cannot work to support themselves. The cash transfer is equal to 1 month's minimum wage, equivalent to 1,412 Brazilian real or $258 as of 2024. The first payments for the BPC began in 1996. At the time, the program supported 346,000 beneficiaries. Today, that number is closer to 5.8 million, second only to Brazil's largest welfare program, the Bolsa Familia. Brazil is roughly the same size as the U.S., but the history and dynamics of the nation mean it took a different development path. The Portuguese who founded Brazil were not settlers, but conquerors. They came from their homeland in search of glory and treasure, whereas most English and subsequent U.S. immigrants migrated to work the land in pursuit of a better life. The Anglo-Saxon culture that predominated was also marked by Britain's Industrial Revolution and other English principles. Limited government, constitutionalism, and an enlightened elite, envisioned as a liberal gentry class, were all characteristics which dominated early founder theory. Brazil attempted to emulate some of these, but failed to find great success in the endeavor. The point is that Brazil's national history has been less than successful. It has largely failed to industrialize, possesses rampant corruption, and large sections of the population live in poverty. As recently as the early 2000s, 6.3% of Brazilians were living on just $1 a day. It is ranked 80th in the world in terms of GDP per capita, behind countries such as Turkey, Mexico, and Trinidad and Tobago. It is not surprising, then, that the country's politicians have adopted social programs as a means to alleviate this dysfunction. These programs enjoy widespread support among the country's poor, especially in the North and Northeast. With the Bolsa Familia and the BPC, lawmakers can help millions in need, as well as secure voting blocks. Also important are two more dynamics. First, Brazil is rapidly aging. The number of elderly aged 65 and older, the age which citizens become eligible for BPC benefits, has increased from 14.1 million to 22.2 million over the last decade. This group makes up 11% of the current population and is projected to nearly triple by 2070. With each year that goes on, Brazil finds itself with a larger dependent population and a lower share of workers to support the seniors. This drives future growth of the BPC. The other dynamic worth mentioning is the nature of the country's poor. We have already mentioned there is great poverty in the north and northeast, but the economic divide is not strictly geographic but also racial. Large portions of the northern Brazilians are of Afro-Brazilian or Amerindian ancestry, and these groups are on average significantly poorer than the national average. The racial divides make inequality a heated issue, as stances on race and class drive political debate compared to national interest. The origins of Brazilian welfare lie in these national characteristics, as the country's constitution uniquely reinforces social welfare as a citizen's right. The vast protections were intended to combat the discrimination and excesses of the military dictatorship, but a side effect is that the BPC today is much easier to expand than it is to cut. The popularity of the social programs means that their mandate has gradually expanded, both in the number of beneficiaries as well as the total value of the transfers themselves. The Bolsa Familia and the BPC now account for 96% of Brazil's social assistance spending and represent almost 13% of the country's total GDP. For a nation that is still developing, this is an astonishingly high amount, only losing out to Nordic countries such as Norway and Denmark. Even older countries such as Portugal or Japan don't show the same spending patterns. As the BPC has outpaced national GDP growth, the math no longer makes sense. BTG Pactual, a Brazilian investment bank, estimates the BPC is growing at a rate of 10% year on year, and economists believe that spending on BPC and pensions is still underestimated by about 20 billion Brazilian real. This is why Lula has called his finance minister, Fernando Haddad, and asked for cuts to be made in the federal budget. The government confidently believes it can end payments to 9.5% of BPC beneficiaries, but one should bear in mind that this figure has already been halved when compared to last year's projections. In addition, the administration adopted a new framework in 2023 to balance the federal budget. The new framework attempts to set a range in which to anchor spending, pegging it to revenue growth. There is a minimum floor that public investment must reach, and the new system allows for counter-cyclical measures by letting spending be tied to inflation instead of revenue. Rather than distributive measures, Brazil would be better off balancing its budget and redirecting spending to development goals, initiatives that can drive future growth in the country. This is what East Asian states such as Japan, Taiwan, and China have done, with governments in the 1960s to 1990s focused on job creation and industrial upgrading. These countries specifically adopted a platform of land reform and drove workers toward the manufacturing sector. During the industrialization, the incomes of those engaged in the production of goods and services rose faster than those in other areas. Inequality rose, but programs beyond supplying the basic provisions were virtually non-existent. Instead, mass employment was the key issue, both to prevent a communist uprising, as was the case in Taiwan, and to facilitate rapid economic growth, the raison d'etre of the CCP. It was essential that the people remain employed. This productivist model, or what others call the developmental welfare state, achieved great success for these countries. Post-World War II, per capita GDP rose at an average annual rate of 7.1% in Japan. Taiwan and Young-era China had similar, if not more impressive rates. Governments in the region learned the playbook and used the strategy to great effect. By deferring short-term gains, these states achieved wealth on a nationwide scale. Brazil, a middle-income country, possesses a state apparatus too weak, volatile, and inefficient to undertake such large initiatives as direct cash transfers to its 59 million poor. Common prosperity must first be based in improvements in the political, economic, and social foundations of the country, not band-aid policies meant to hide dysfunction. To uplift its masses, Brazil must first finish its industrialization, and this might mean cutting the BPC.